Okay, I think we'll get started now, just as we gave a few minutes for everyone to settle in. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our event, Lula versus Land Grabs, Harvard's role in the financialization of land and the future of climate justice in Brazil. My name is Julie Chung. I'm Harvard College class of 2020, and I'm a first-year medical student at Harvard Medical School. And I'm also a member of the Stop Harvard Land Grabs organizing team. We wanted to do this event given Lula's recent victory over the right-wing candidate Bolsonaro, and many see this moment as one of renewed opportunities to fight for indigenous rights, protect the Amazon and the Cerrado, and strengthen social movements. Yet we all know that there is still so much to be done. So we really wanted to ask and inform everyone who's joining us today, what do Harvard and other foreign corporations have to do with this? And what are frontline communities in Brazil asking of us today? So we have three amazing panelists joining us today. First, we have Maria Luisa Mendonça, who holds a PhD in human geography from University of Sao Paulo and is a research scholar at the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics of the CUNY Graduate Center. She is co-director of the Network for Social Justice and Human Rights in Brazil and the author of Political Economy of Agribusiness. Next up, we'll have Jeff Conant, who directs Friends of the Earth's International Forests Program. And let me paste some of these bios in the chat as well. So Friends of the Earth's International Forest Program, which protects forests and the rights of forest-dependent peoples by addressing the economic drivers of forest destruction. He is the author of A Poetics of Resistance, the Revolutionary Public Relations of the Zapatista Insurgency, and the co-author and coordinator of A Community Guide to Environmental Health, which is a grassroots educational manual published in over a dozen languages. And last but not least, we'll have Sydney Chalhoub, who's a professor of history and African American studies at Harvard University. He is also a faculty affiliate of the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures. He taught at the University of Campinas, Brazil for 30 years before coming to Harvard in the fall of 2015. And his research and writing focus mainly on the social history of Brazil in the 19th and early 20th centuries, with emphasis on the history of slavery, race, and public health. So thank you to our amazing panelists for joining us today. And finally, I wanted to make a quick plug for Stop Harvard Land Grabs. We're a coalition of Harvard students and alumni organizing in solidarity with frontline communities to end Harvard's destructive farmland investments all around the world and demand reparations. So I'm going to share our petition in the chat. We really encourage you to sign it if you haven't already and send it to anyone who you know would be interested in this. There's going to be a comment section in the petition, and we would also love to hear what brought you to the event today. So I'm going to hand over the mic to Maria Luisa, who will talk for about 10 minutes about just what's happening in Brazil in the current moment.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. My organization is the Network for Social Justice and Human Rights in Brazil. So you have our website, and we have information in Portuguese and English. We published several reports about this issue of financial speculation with farmland in Brazil. We can move to the next slide, please. And yes, we started to identify this process of land grabbing in Brazil by financial institutions after the global economic crisis of 2008 and the collapse of the housing market in the US. So we identified that agribusiness corporations partnered with oil and financial corporations to expand this system of monocropping plantations. One example was Cosan, which is the largest sugarcane corporation in Brazil that partnered with oil giant Shell. And from that partnership, they created a subsidiary company called Radar, that was a different type of cooperation with the role of speculating in farmland markets. And then we found out that the main source of funding for that corporation was TAA, which is a large pension fund in the US that also receives funds from European and Canadian pension funds. And together with TAA, we also found out that Harvard University was another key player in that process. So after the economic crisis, those financial corporations, in that case, Harvard's corporation and TAA, were major players in financing the expansion of agribusiness in Brazil. And with two main consequences. One is that when you create a large fund to buy land around the world, you put communities at risk of displacement, rural communities and small farmers. And also, although the main goal of these corporations is control over land, in order to justify that, they then partner with agribusiness corporations to expand plantations with huge environmental impacts. So in the next slide, I will show you a photo of the main region where these corporations operate. It's the Brazilian Cerrado, which is the largest savanna in the world and the most biodiverse savanna. And especially during the Bolsonaro administration, we saw that they used this type of neocolonial discourse as if this was all empty land, basically inviting foreign corporations to expand plantations in Brazil. And also because of Bolsonaro's policies and rhetoric, we saw an increasing violence against rural communities that are resisting this process of land grabbing and environmental destruction. So, you know, these corporations, they claim that what they do is sustainable, you know, Harvard, TAA, those corporations, but we know that a large plantation cannot be sustainable because it demands large amounts of water and chemical inputs that destroy the soil and destroy food production by local communities. So when we hear about fires in the Amazon, in the Cerrado in Brazil, and in other regions of Brazil, we don't know, this is the main process financing fires and deforestation, and this is still happening right now. So in the next slide, I will give you some examples of how we have been working closely with rural communities in Brazil, and how you know, we have been also organizing in the US and internationally to advocate against this process of land grabbing and also to support communities. So we have several strategies. The communities have created collective spaces to discuss strategies for legal and advocacy work. So we work at the local level in addition to the international level as well. We have been producing lots of grassroots and public educational materials that you can find in our website in Portuguese and English. So the communities that were isolated before now are in this amazing process of organizing, and international solidarity is very important for their protection. And now, of course, with the change in government, with Lula winning the elections, social movements in Brazil have been part of this transition already, the transition that Lula is putting in place. So, for example, the new government is going to create Indigenous Peoples Ministry. So it's an amazing moment for us to keep organizing and to keep pressuring Harvard corporations and Harvard Corporation and other agribusiness corporations in the US that have a key role in this destructive system. So the next slide is just information about our campaign, our coalition, the Stop Land Grabs Coalition, and you can all get involved and find more information. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maria Luisa. So next we're going to hear from Jeff Conant. And just to let people know, after that, we'll hear from Sydney Chalou, and then we'll have an audience Q&A. So you'll have a chance to ask your questions. So I'll hand it off to Jeff now.
Thank you so much, Julie, and everyone. I'm just really thrilled to be here, especially speaking as a non-academic. Really honored to be among such esteemed colleagues and friends. I'm going to take off from where Maria Luisa left off a little bit to focus essentially on two pieces from Maria Luisa's last slide: the international advocacy and organizing aspects of what we're trying to do, and linking up with the Harvard Stop Land Grabs campaign, essentially beginning by saying fighting land grabbing is key to the global struggle for climate justice. In 2019, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned the world that industrial agriculture was actually a far bigger driver of global warming than previously realized. You know, when we think about the climate emergency, we tend to begin by thinking about fossil fuels, but the IPCC's analysis focused on land degradation, sustainable land management, food security, and greenhouse gas fluxes in terrestrial ecosystems. And the message was clear that global deforestation driven by industrial agriculture is a far bigger cause of climate change than previously reflected in global discussions. And most surprisingly, that industrial agriculture and what we call the industrial agri-food chain taken as a whole is almost as big a driver of climate change as fossil fuels. At Friends of the Earth, I run a campaign that we call Land Grabs, Forests, and Finance, with the objective of halting the destruction of tropical forests by halting the expansion of agribusiness plantations, specifically for soy, palm oil, and other what we call forest risk commodities. And a key tenet of this campaign is that for companies to destroy the forests and convert them to plantations, first, of course, they need to get a hold of the land underneath these forests. And that's why, you know, some environmental groups really focus on the forests. We really focus on the land and the human rights of forest-dwelling people. And in essence, by perpetuating the model of financial speculation in land, Harvard's endowment is directly perpetuating this crucial aspect of climate injustice. And it's really late in the game. I mean, it's outrageous for Harvard to be this deeply invested in climate injustice when, you know, we all know that we're deep into the climate emergency. Lula's victory in Brazil, we hope, will represent a sea change back to progressive policies that protect indigenous peoples and prevent the wholesale destruction of the Amazon and the Cerrado and the other crucial biomes in Brazil. But the fact is, no matter who is in charge in Brazil, a significant part of the responsibility for the harm being done there falls to multinational corporations. And in our case, many corporations that are based in the US over which we have some measure of leverage. So a couple of what you're seeing on the screen here are two recent reports that we've produced at Friends of the Earth with partners. The second one, Red-Handed Deforestation and Bunge's Silent Conquest, having been written mostly by Maria Luisa and colleagues at the Rede Social in Brazil, with some contributions from Friends of the Earth and myself. BlackRock, the largest asset manager in the world with over $10 trillion in assets, is, and based, of course, in Wall Street in New York, is heavily invested in companies active in Brazil. So we've been targeting them to change their investment practices. The report you're looking at here looks at BlackRock's investments in rainforest destroying companies and showed in 2019 that BlackRock was had increased its investments in palm oil, soy, timber, paper, and the other commodities that are driving deforestation. And since this report came out, they've continued to increase rather than decrease these investments. So BlackRock is a major, continues to be a major target of the climate justice movement. Major U.S. multinationals like Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, Cargill, and Louis Dreyfus are major producers of soy and livestock in Brazil, so we target them broadly. There's a lot of NGOs that are targeting these big agribusiness traders. In the case of Bunge, the object of the report displayed here, essentially we showed with the Rede Social that Bunge has a monopoly on land and on the soy trade in significant portions of the Brazilian Cerrado. Therefore, the land grabbing and land conversion in those regions of the Cerrado that may not be driven by Bunge, this American corporation, will still result in Bunge's soy supply chains being exposed to and being linked to and being complicit in this kind of land grabbing and land speculation and the deforestation that accompanies it. Therefore, we're demanding that Bunge put in place responsible policies to help turn down the land grabbing and the land speculation in the Cerrado. One of the ways we're doing that is running a campaign to actually get Bunge shareholders to vote against the board of directors of this company. We don't believe that any of these big agribusiness traders are going to change their stripes, if you will, just due to reputational pressure. We do believe that over time, with enough pressure, we can force out the corporate boards of some of these big companies and potentially have them replaced with individuals who may be able to actually change the business model on which they're predicated. I think we can go to the next slide, please. So one of the important aspects of the climate justice struggle and climate justice movement is to connect the dots and link the campaigns to build an intersectional movement. Since about 2016, well, Maria Luisa mentioned TIAA, the largest, the manager of pensions for most academics across the country. Since about 2016, we've been pressuring TIAA to address its land grabbing and its investments in industrial agriculture. And a few years ago, a group calling itself TIAA Divest appeared to start pushing TIAA to divest from fossil fuels. And so we teamed up with them. And now their demands are our demands, and our demands are their demands. And the point being, there is no way through the climate crisis without building a movement that combines, pressure on fossil fuels and pressure on big ag, and looks at the money driving both of those problems to take on the entirety of the extractive economy. And similarly, while we're looking at the role of the world's largest investors in causing the climate crisis by investing in fossil fuels and big ag, we've found it important to also show that these same investors are profiting from the criminalization of climate refugees by the border industrial complex, the prison industrial complex, and the defense industries. So this report you see cashing in on crisis, how the world's largest investors fuel and profit from climate change and border militarization, looks at the connections to the border industrial complex by the biggest investors in the US. And I specifically wanted to raise this because I know the movement at Harvard is also looking at Harvard's exposure to the border industrial complex. And there's no distinction between the companies, the investors that are driving the climate crisis and those that are driving the climate refugee crisis and criminalizing the most vulnerable people who are often coming across our borders because they're fleeing from drought, from hunger, from natural disasters. And wanted to also note Stop the Money Pipeline, which is a great national network that maybe the Harvard Land Grabs campaign could consider joining. It's a coalition of big NGOs that are targeting Wall Street actors for financing climate destruction. And you should have a look at that resource. And maybe we could go to the next slide. Wanted to just quickly go over some of the tactics that we've been using, especially since the pandemic, one of the tactics that we've found useful in putting pressure specifically on TIAA is to work with faculty at various universities to pass faculty senate resolutions. And this, the report there called "Be It Resolved That TIAA Should Invest Responsibly" is essentially a toolkit for academic faculty to take action on deforestation, land grabbing, and human rights. And together with the TIA Divest campaign, we've managed to get dozens now of universities, faculty senates, to adopt resolutions telling their universities to tell TIAA to provide more responsible investment options for their clients. And if the Harvard campaign hasn't yet, you probably have, but if you haven't yet worked with the faculty senate there at Harvard, that's it's a nice strategy to raise awareness and to get the faculty senate to put its power behind your movement. And another tactic that's grown wildly since the pandemic is what we call action hours. This is just the slide for one we've done recently, where essentially we hold an informational webinar like this, but we use part of the time to get everybody involved, everybody on the webinar, to call their fund manager, to call the sustainability directors at whatever corporations we're targeting, to call the shareholders in the corporations we're targeting, and demand that they take action. Excuse me. So it's a nice way to basically use a digital platform to take collective real world action. And maybe you want to do this to join the Harvard movement with other, you've probably already done this, but to join the Harvard movement with other divestment movements, and have other universities do action hours targeting Harvard's endowments, and have you all at Harvard do action hours targeting the endowments and the funds managed by other universities. So that's just a little suggestion there. And then if we could go to the last slide, I wanted to mention something that's very timely right now, which is I just noticed that another tactic is to go to some of the many responsible investment industry events and consortiums. The responsible investment industry is growing by leaps and bounds, and it is essentially a massive greenwashing effort to make the extractive economy look like it can be made a little bit greener and a little bit cleaner. But I would argue that is not anywhere near the case. And sorry about my cough. Sorry about that. I just noticed that Harvard is one of the original, was the first university endowment to join the Principles for Responsible Investing, the PRI, which is one of the world's most recognized sort of consortia of quote unquote responsible investors. And an interesting tactic might be to follow what the TIA campaign has just done, which is to file a complaint to the PRI saying that TIAA is in violation of the responsible investment principles of this body because of its fossil fuel investments, because of its investments in big ag and in land grabbing, and because of its failure to have any kind of human rights standards or real environmental standards. And this complaint has actually received quite a bit of news and does quite a bit to make TIAA look like the irresponsible firm that we believe it is. And so there's a proposal that you consider filing a complaint to the PRI about Harvard as well, which would, I think, raise some eyebrows at the very least. And then, of course, here's some pictures of our friends from TIA Divest out in front of their offices with an old-fashioned style rally, which I know you all are doing as well. But the point there being, use all the tactics all the time. I was really happy to see the recent protests at the Harvard-Yale game, and encourage you to do more of that early and often, and build solidarity across campuses and across borders. And I will leave it there. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Jeff. So far we've had the opportunity to hear from Maria Luisa about what the bigger picture is of how land grabbing has impacted Brazil. And then we just heard from Jeff about the different angles of the international campaign and strategies of the intersectional movement at play here. We're going to hear right now from Professor Sidney Talub, who's more specifically going to talk about Harvard's role in all of this, and speak to the relevance of perhaps some of us are members of the Harvard community or are interested in holding Harvard accountable for their actions. So after Sydney speaks, we'll have also the opportunity for a Q&A, and I'll hand it off to Sydney right now.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you for inviting me to be with you today. The facts that bring us together to this event today are crystal clear. Maria Luisa and Jeff have summarized them to us one more time. These are facts presented in several research reports elaborated by the Network for Social Justice and Human Rights, by Friends of the Earth and other organizations, published in scholarly journals, studied in graduate programs in Brazil, present in the new medias multiple times. The amount of evidence is staggering and keeps accumulating despite our university, deafening silence on the matter. It bears repeating with the addition of two brief reflections in the end. In the years after the 2008 global economic crisis, the Harvard Management Company invested a meaningful portion of the university's endowment in natural resources. In Brazil, although it's hard to have precise numbers, reports speak of $1 billion and 150,000 to 1 million hectares of land. These investments brought further deterioration to the environment in the Cerrado region and increased poverty and violence in the area. The Cerrado, as Maria Luisa just reminded us, is the largest and most diverse tropical savanna in the world. Corporate investment in the area, conspicuously Harvard's and pension funds, have caused increase in land prices, thus fires to provoke deforestation, eviction of traditional peasant communities which had been using the land there for subsistence agriculture for generations, increasing violence against these communities by local big bosses interested in land grabs to expand agribusiness, and so on, in a pattern of tragic events all too familiar. In the case of Harvard's investments, there are court litigations underway because part of the farmland acquired by the university has allegedly originated in previous land grabs, thus rendering its land titles illegal. It is the type of thing that raises big questions about the possibility of acquisitions undertaken without proper due diligence. In the past few years, realizing that it had not done a good deal, the Harvard Management Company has been trying hard to sell the farmland it had acquired in the area. It seems a perfect solution for the HMC, which is under the imperative of making the endowment grow at whatever cost. After helping to deteriorate the human rights situation and the environmental conditions in the area, the solution is to jump off the boat, making a profit. I confess that at this point, I'm a bit tired of facts. They are so overwhelming that discussing them is no longer our main task. Of course, research must continue because it is a moral imperative, our moral imperative. Doing the research to gather the facts of the issue means struggling for transparency. It means undermining the politics of silence adopted by the university regarding its endowment in general and concerning the damage caused to the Brazilian Cerrado and its populations in particular. So my first concern here is what I call Harvard's politics of silence regarding the issue. Why is it that Harvard is not transparent about how it invests the university's endowment? Why is the university administration complicit with the politics of silence and obfuscation adopted by the Harvard Management Company? This is a dangerous policy. And here I'm going to proceed more informally because these two ideas that will follow, I still need to elaborate and write about it more carefully. But the first thing that comes to my mind is that very recently Harvard has had this wonderful project called The Legacy of Slavery. What that project unearthed was a wealth of documentation present in the university archives about Harvard's involvement with slavery. Although the university, the research unearthed evidence of maybe 70 or 80 enslaved people, at least, present on campus in different times until the 18th century. The research also showed that Harvard benefited greatly from the slave trade, from the exploration of slavery in the Caribbean, in the US South, in the form of donations and other investments that big figures in the university had in the slavery and all the businesses associated with slavery. So the values that informed the Harvard Legacy of Slavery project were transparency, historical truth, reparations, valuing diversity, dealing with a problematic past instead of trying to sweep it under the carpet indefinitely. But have no illusion, Harvard did it because of social pressure, because of the pressure of social movements, especially the Black movement and many other movements that allied with it. They were forced to move. They did not choose to do so. Does the university plan to have, in 100 years from now, a new project called perhaps Harvard's Legacy of Environmental Destruction Initiative? Is that Harvard's plan? Have no doubt, because we should have no doubt. Truth will prevail. And whatever is being hidden now will come to the surface. I'm a historian, and I believe in historians. We will find out, however long it takes. So this is my first question. The first thing I think we need to move this conversation to two questions. This is the first one. We need to hold the university accountable for the silence it has adopted on the subject and draw the parallels between what it has been doing in regard to slavery and what it seems to plan to continue to do in regard to environmental destruction in its many facets and in regard to how it spends the endowment money. The second thing, which I think we need to make the university confront, is the continuation of what I call the politics of magical economic thinking. The idea that the main thing we need to worry about in regard to the endowment is that it grows as much as possible is linked to a type of economic thinking that came before the science of climate destruction came into being and before the Anthropocene has been theorized and conceptualized by social scientists and by many other fields of knowledge. Once these science and these theories are adopted, and the university is actually nurturing research and investigations to foster the acknowledgement of these two things, then the idea that the only thing that matters about the endowment is to grow indefinitely doesn't make any sense. Right? To grow at all cost doesn't make any sense. So the university can no longer live with these intolerable contradiction between a college and graduate programs governed by science, by values such as diversity, social justice, reparations, and so on, and think about the endowment as not accountable, as not bound by these values, as allowed and allowing the Harvard Management Company and the corporation, who is actually the really responsible one for what's happening and should be held accountable. It cannot go on acting in regard to the endowment as if it had no accountability, it had no explanations to give to us. They keep saying that Harvard is us. Okay, we are Harvard, so give us the explanations you owe us. That's it.
Thank you so much, Sydney. It was really great to hear from your perspective. And I know I speak for everyone when I say I think it's really inspiring to hear about your thoughts about what Harvard ought to do in this moment. Before we move on to the audience Q&A, I just wanted to share once more the petition that Stop Harvard Land Grabs has opened on Action Network. And if you sign up for this petition, you'll also be on our mailing list. You get updates about our events and initiatives, as well as our monthly newsletter. And if you are interested in being even more involved, feel free to email us at stopharvardlandgrabs@gmail.com, and you can join our organizing team. Maybe if Rachel or Caleb, you want to speak just for a minute about different initiatives and actions we've done in the past.
Sure. Yeah, I can just share briefly. Thanks so much, Julie. So this iteration of Stop Harvard Land Grabs builds on years of campus organizing around land grabs, fossil fuel divestment, many other endowment justice issues. But in its current formation has been around for about 2 years now. We've hosted a public forum, which is available on our website recording if you would like to look back on that. Developed a research library of every article that has dove into Harvard's land grabs over more than 10 years of research, and you have to scroll for a long time. This is well-researched stuff, as Sydney was saying. We have worked in close partnership with other endowment justice groups around fossil fuel divestment, around prisons and borders, and the occupation of Palestine. All these issues intersect and have led to additional forums, actions, protests. We had a protest this past spring as well. All of this is demanding a response from the corporation and at least a response, if not actual action. And we have been slow to hear back from them. So we continue to push right now, working with a group of law students on that angle, working on media and narrative work to ensure that Harvard is taking us seriously and cannot afford to continue this culture of silence, as Sydney said. So it's an exciting time to be part of this group. If you're a Harvard affiliated student or an alum, faculty, or staff especially, but really everyone has a stake in this because Harvard claims to and does in some way set an example for other investors and other universities across the country. So there is a place for anyone who is interested in being part of this work.
Great. Thank you, Rachel, so much for sharing. And now finally we get to move on to the portion where hopefully we get to hear from our other audience members about whatever questions they had for our panelists or general questions that they wanted to ask. So feel free to either unmute yourself and ask, or if you want, you can also paste your question in the chat and I can read it out for you.
Well, I wanted to ask a question. I can kick things off. Can you hear me all right?
Yes,
Great.
we can hear you.
My question's about, well, it's really like, what does justice look like in this case? I think we're talking about sort of maybe a couple of things with Harvard's land grabs. Like, one is looking at all the harm that Harvard has done in the past and tried to move away from, and I feel like that conversation is very related to reparations, and looking at how do you make things right that were harmed in the past, and the other is how do you prevent future harm from happening. So I'm just curious to our speakers, like what does justice look like?
I can say a few things based on what the communities have been discussing. I think it's very important to understand that the communities that have been impacted by this process of land grabbing have been living in this region for many generations. So before that, it was all public land. And then Harvard, TA, and these players partnered with local land grabbers and basically privatized huge pieces of land. But based on our research and legal advocacy, we also have a legal process, as Sydney mentioned, and to show that the illegalities in this process and the human rights violations in the communities are advocating to have collective titles of the land, so they have their land rights guaranteed, although they have been living in the region for many generations, and according to the Brazilian law, they have land rights. They want to have collective regularization of the land, and there are several communities that started this process, but they're constantly facing violence from local land grabbers, and also we constantly hear from them about fires and deforestation. So we are, on a daily basis having to denounce this and call for action and solidarity. So if Harvard could really acknowledge the harm and support the land rights for communities, so the communities will take back the land and get reparations for the harm and the social and environmental impacts, I think this will have a huge impact on other players in Brazil as well.
Can I quickly address the question in the chat by Brita, which I think is really important? She asks if Harvard is not transparent about its investments. What evidence is there that Harvard has been involved in land grabs where have these occurred in Brazil? Well, of course, there are many of the reports. Nothing can replace, as Lydia has just added, the reading of the reports, which show the evidence that is possible to gather about Harvard presence there. Of course, the whole thing is hidden. I mean, these reports show there is what I call maybe an outsourcing of this investment. Harvard has subsidiaries, or sometimes are the ones buying or making the transactions in Brazil. But it's possible to trace back these subsidiaries to the Harvard corporate, to the Harvard management company. About the damage, there are lots of research teams that went on the ground, that made audible interviews, that learned about the conditions of these people. So there is overwhelming evidence. And there is a dissertation, which I think is really interesting, defended in Brazil by a researcher called Jéssica Siviero Vicente. It's called a new type of it's in Portuguese, a new type of landlord, of land proprietors, which is specifically, it's a more than 200-page work about Harvard's investments in natural resources in Brazil, with also a wealth of documentation. And if you allow me one last observation, the pattern that Maria Luisa was describing was not invented by Harvard and TIAA in Brazil, right? I mean, it's been for generations that as the agribusiness frontier expands, people who had been indigenous populations, rural peasant communities of different sorts, former enslaved communities who have been using the land close to the forests or in the forests for many generations. As agribusiness expands, then local landlords, local thugs get interested because the price of land goes up, and then using violence and fire, they achieve deforestation and in the communities who don't have any formal title to the land except the possession of it in practice for generations are dispossessed of their land or proletariat or become peasants, poor peasants working for the new landlords. So this is also a historical process that has been there for a long time. What happens since after 2008 is that it expanded to the Cerrado area and to other areas in a speed that only multinationals can afford, right? And the destruction of the environment and the human rights violations have increased. But I encourage you to read, Brita. There is a lot of information and lots of sources available to get around Harvard's silence and know what's going on.
It looks like, let's see, the question about what's happening at the Divinity School has been somewhat answered in the chat. If you still have questions about that, James, feel free to, you can ask again and we can open up the floor once more. Victor has somewhat of a more specific question. Are there any efforts from the organizations mentioned during the presentations to support/finance the fight of Indigenous peoples in Brazil against Bill 490/2007? Victor, did you want to unmute yourself, and no pressure to do this, unmute yourself and explain what this bill is and what it's about for the rest of the audience members?
Sure. So this is a bill that has been lingering in the Brazilian Congress, and it's about a legal time frame that would consider when the indigenous territory would be considered as such. So there are several discussions, and more recently, the agribusiness and also gold mining campaigners have tried to push this bill forward. And that would mean that indigenous people who have been persecuted during the military regime in Brazil, and that had to flee from their original territory, would no longer have the rights to that territory. Basically, trying to put it in simple words.
Do any of the panelists have quick comments about this to respond to Victor's question?
Well, I'm going to say just a few things, and maybe Sydney can add. I think that we have strong coalitions in Brazil that are pressuring the Brazilian government and Congress members. And so I think the key thing is how to connect the pressure in Brazil with, players in Brazil and the international corporations and universities that are part of that. So, Harvard, for example, and TIAA, they are benefiting from this process of deregulation of land rights in the country. So I think that those things are connected, but depending on the players, the strategy will be different from, depending on who we are pressuring. So, but I think that if Harvard would disclose information, would have a meeting with impacted communities, they have refused. to meet with members of the impacted communities in Brazil and acknowledge the problem, then of course, it would be a huge step for indigenous movements, social movements in Brazil, to keep the pressure on Brazilian Congress and other players in the country.
Lydia, I noticed you put a couple things in the chat. Is there anything else you wanted to share as well?
No, I mean, I was responding to Victor's question. So as a coalition, we haven't done work directly around the question that he was putting out, but as an organization, Grassroots International, we've supported groups who are indigenous groups who are part of the mobilizations against the establishment of this time frame limitation on the rights to territory. I did have a question. Maybe it's related to the one that it's kind of related to Britta's one here about the new administration. But yeah, I was wondering if maybe Maisa or anyone else wanted to speak to kind of what things are looking like post-election, and what expectations might be with the Lula administration coming in.
I can try to say a couple of things. Well, it's very hard to say because Lula won the election by a very small margin. And in order to govern, he's already making all sorts of political alliances that will make a progressive administration hard to imagine. In any case, whatever is going to happen, it's not going to be near anything that has been happening in the past few years. And in terms of trying to protect these communities, I think there is a big chance that Lula is going to invest heavily on it, because even to my surprise, because Lula grew up as a politician defending what I'm calling here magical economic thinking, growth, building cars and industry and so on. He has changed it radically. I mean, most of what he's been saying in the past couple months about what his administration is going to be like is really focused on environmental questions. So he is really looking toward a new type of economic policy and development. And I think he's betting on this, and that might have an important impact in regard to what kind of attitude the government, the administration is going to have in relation to international corporations that are damaging the environment in Brazil. And in his first speech in the international forum, he said, well, I'm here not only to care for the environment in Brazil, but to demand that you take up your responsibilities to protect the environment in Brazil. So I think in this area, it might be the case that he will push forward with policies that may protect his communities. But it's a constant struggle. I mean, international organizations keeping the pressure is, of course, absolutely essential for things to move in a good direction. Sorry, I tried to sound hopeful, but there's a lot of risk.
Yeah, well, I just want to say that I think one positive element is that this administration will be much more concerned about its international image. So I think we can have a bigger impact, of course, in terms of putting pressure. But like what Sydney was saying and what Jeff said before, the role of international corporations is key. So as international organizations, students, faculty based in the US and in other countries, I think keeping that pressure is very important no matter what is happening in Brazil.
Before we move on to the last couple questions. Oh, so I see that Victor has raised their hand. I just wanted to get to Magdalena's question in the chat from a while ago. Are there resources for finding out which other universities in the USA and Canada are investing in this? Does anyone have an answer for this?
Well, I think in the Stop Land Grab website, you can find information and other petitions, yes, so we have reports and information. TAA, is basically present in all universities in the country, or most universities, but I think Harvard has a key role in terms of the size of its endowment and its role in targeting farmland.
Thank you for that. And Victor, if you want to close the discussion with the final question, since I know we're hitting the hour mark.
So actually, it wasn't a question. I just wanted to contribute to the discussion in terms of what we are going to have for the next couple of years. I'm also very hopeful that first of all, we are going to have dialogue again, because over the past 4 years, as Brazilians and people concerned with the environment, we did not have that. It was nearly impossible to have access to clear data about deforestation, human rights violation, land grabbing, and so on. And it was under Lula's administration where we saw deforestation rates coming from over 20,000 and down to 7,000, which is a great mark. Of course, it's not perfect, but it is a great mark. However, I also have experience working with the Federal Prosecution Service in the past, and also in the federal justice. And I think that's something that is going to be very important if we want to achieve better results, is to have this kind of dialogue that we are having right now, because the organized society is essential to denounce human rights violations, deforestation, and all sorts of crime, but also acting as partners to support the works of organizations such as the Federal Prosecution Service. That was my contribution.
Thank you all so much for joining our event today. Again, for that quick plug, to make sure you sign our petition and send it to really everyone that you know. And in the petition, you'll be able to have the option of signing up for our organizing team as well. And in the comment section of the petition, be sure to indicate, what drew you to this particular event. We really hope to have events like this next semester as well. I think part of working in an educational institution is that constant re-education as students cycle in and cycle out. So even though it can seem like we're repeating the message at times, I know certainly for students like myself, even though I went to undergrad at Harvard, there's always so much growth to be had and so much more to learn that you often don't hear about or don't think about when you're moving through the institution. So I know I really appreciated this event and I learned so much, and I really hope that we can keep the energy up, make sure that we're drawing in more and more people to this movement, because what all the panelists today had to say has really, really moved me. And I really hope that we can keep this up. So we'll send this recording to you all. Make sure you send it to everybody. And it was really great seeing you all today.
Thanks so much for hosting us and for joining, everyone.